So I'll start with reading Romans 2:17 through 20, and feel free to drop in the chat or raise your hand if you have a question. And I'm trying to guess what your questions are as we go along. So this is Paul speaking, and he says in 2:17, he says, "Now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and boast in God, if you know his will and approve of what is superior because you are instructed by the law, if you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of little children, because you have in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth." And then he goes on from there, but I want to stop to break down what 17 through 20 is about. Right now, Paul is speaking to Jewish people, and he's saying, listen, if you think that you're better than everyone else because you've been given the law, because you have a previous prior knowledge of God, where your ancestors had had the law passed down to them, you think that you're superior because you know these things, that you're an instructor to the foolish, you are a light to those in darkness, you're a guide for blind people. And then what Paul does is he begins to ask some questions in verse 21. Now, again, keep in mind he's speaking specifically to Jewish people. In verse 21, he starts having sort of a hypothetical conversation with himself, and this is what he says. Uh, you then, who teach others, do you not teach yourself? You who preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that people should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? And then in verse 24, it says, as it is written, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Now, Paul is sort of having a conversation with himself here by like asking a question, by giving an example and then asking a question. You then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? Now remember, he's speaking specifically to Jewish people here. In a way, this conversation that he's having with himself, he's able to have because before he came to Christ, he was one of these Jewish people. He thought he knew better than everyone else because he had the law. And when it came to these other Christians, these little Christ, these little Jesuses who used to be good Jews, but now they're following Jesus. He's like, how dare they do that? They're not supposed to do that. Don't they know how things are written? One of the things that the Pharisees did was they picked apart every little thing in Jesus's life and was always trying to point out how he was possibly breaking laws. For example, by claiming to be God, that's breaking one of the laws. However, it's not breaking a law if you actually are God, which Jesus was. Other things that the Pharisees would point out with Jesus and his disciples, they'd say something along the fact, like they'd be out walking during the day, and they might pick some heads of grain off a passing field as they were going by to like eat. And they said, hey, that's working. Now, in our minds, that doesn't really seem like working. It would be like if we're outside walking next to an apple orchard and we pick an apple and we start eating that apple. We're not working, we're eating. But because the Jewish people were so strict about the laws, they wanted to say, well, you know what, it's kind of like working. And if it's kind of like working, then that means it's working. And you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath, which means you're breaking God's law. So they were constantly trying to find ways that other people were breaking the law, but they were always looking at other people and they were not looking at themselves. And Paul was one of these people. And so this is why in verse 21, he starts out then, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? You who preach against stealing, do you steal? It's people who are always pointing the fingers at other people, but it turns out that they are the ones that are actually doing wrong. You who say that people should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who say that you abhor or hate idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? And that is exactly who Paul was. And so he's kind of calling out his own people at this point, saying like, how dare you think that you're even better than anyone else? He knew what it was like to think that he was more spiritual than other people. And then it goes on to say in verse 24, as it is written, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. That's actually from the book of Isaiah, chapter 52, verse 5. And it's another way of saying, you think you're better than everyone else, don't you? Well, no, not really. Whoa, I just had loud thunder. So sorry. Anyway, Paul is saying here that you think you're better than everyone else, but you aren't really better than everyone else. And in fact, the rest of the world looks down on God because you are his people and you're supposed to represent him. And that's what Paul is saying to the Jews here, is that you need to be better than this, and you really aren't better. Now, the question is, what does this mean for us? Because whenever we look at scripture, we also want to ask the question, well, what did it mean for the people then to who it was being written to? But then what does it mean for us today? And for us, we actually have the whole law in front of us right now. Even though we are not Jewish people, we still have the first 5 books of the Bible. We have the entire Bible in its wholeness. And so we're able to take it and read it, understand it. Unlike the Gentiles at that time when this was being written, they weren't really introduced to the Old Testament laws when this letter to the Roman churches were being written. So for us, we need to understand that we have the whole law, but we're not supposed to lord it over other people. And sometimes Christians do that. They take laws and they think that, oh, we're superior because we know the truth and you don't, and you're supposed to do this, and we hold it against them in society today. And it's very important that we don't have that attitude. Ultimately, it's all about Jesus and pointing people to him. It's about having faith in him, not about following the law. And so while Romans goes back and forth between speaking to Jews and speaking to Gentiles, it's very important to keep in mind that there was a separation here. And Paul, in a way, was trying to break down the walls of separation, saying, you think that you're special because you have this. You think that you're special because you're like this. You're really not that special. All it boils down to is your relationship with Jesus. So with that being said, I want to share another video with you guys, and I want to make sure that the volume works. So if it's not working, like raise your hand, speak up, say something, and I will stop it. But let me stop sharing that window and share this one now. Okay. Again, let me know if the audio doesn't work.
If you've been around Christians, you've probably heard of the idea of having a personal relationship with God, which could mean different things in the Bible, like having God as a friend, or your father, or maybe your teacher.
But there's one particular way that the Bible talks about this relationship that you find all over. But strangely, we don't talk about it that much. And that's the idea of a partnership with God.
A partnership like working alongside someone to accomplish a goal together.
Right, and this is actually what you see at the beginning of the Bible. God creates this good world full of all of this potential. And then God appoints these unique creatures, humans, as his partners in bringing more and more goodness out of all that potential.
But the humans don't want to partner with God. They rebel and try to create a world on their own terms.
And so this broken partnership is the Bible's explanation for why we're stuck in a world of corruption and injustice and the tragedy of death.
It's not like there's just one or two humans who have bailed on this relationship. In the story of the Bible, everyone has abandoned the partnership with God.
So what God does is select a smaller group of people out of the many, and he makes a new partnership with them called a covenant.
Now, real quick, I want to point out that when we talked about the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament, another word for testament is covenant or agreement. And so what we have here in the Old Testament is we have the old covenant that we have with God, and then the New Testament is going to be the New Testament or new agreement, new covenant that we have. We'll discuss that a little bit. Pay close attention to when we talk about the second covenant here in the covenants that they're about to share. It's the one about Abraham. But anyway, so this is about God sharing a covenant with his people.
And in a covenant, God makes promises and then in exchange asks his partner to fulfill certain commitments. And the purpose of all of this is to somehow use this covenant relationship to renew his partnership with everybody else.
Now, there are actually 4 times in the Old Testament that we're told God initiates a covenant relationship with Noah, Abraham, the nation of Israel, and King David.
And it's through these that God is forming a covenant family into which all people will eventually be invited.
So let's see how these work. The first one is with Noah.
So in this story, God has just brought the flood to cleanse the world of humanity's corruption, and Noah and his family are the only ones left. And so God makes a covenant with Noah, saying, listen, I know that humans will continue to be evil, but despite that, I'm not going to destroy it like this again. Instead, the earth will be this reliable place for us to work together.
Great. So what does Noah have to do?
Nothing. And that's what's so interesting about this first covenant, is that God is promising to be faithful, even though he knows humans won't be.
The next time we see God make a covenant is with a man named Abraham. God chooses him, promises to bless him, give him a large family, lots of land where they can flourish.
And in return, God asks Abraham to trust him and train up his family to do what is right and just. And the whole reason for this covenant is God says that somehow he's going to bring his blessing to all families of the world through this one family.
So that's Abraham. The next time we see God make a covenant is when Abraham's family grows into the tribe of Israel.
And this covenant is with the whole tribe. God asks them to obey a set of laws, which are these guidelines for living well as a community of God's partners. And if they do this, then God promises to bless them and that they will become a people who then represent him to the rest of humanity.
That's the covenant with Israel. The last covenant is with King David.
Yeah, the tribe of Israel has become this large nation, ruled by David. And God asked David and his descendants to partner with him by leading Israel in obeying the laws and doing what is right and just. And God promises that one day, one of David's sons will come and extend God's kingdom of peace and blessing over all the nations.
So those are the 4 covenants that God makes in order to restore his partnership with the whole world.
But here's what happens. Israel breaks the covenant. They worship other gods, they allow horrible injustice, and so they lose their land and are forced off into exile.
So it seems hopeless. But during this time, Israel's prophets talked about a day when God would restore these covenants in spite of Israel's failure, somehow.
Yeah, they called it the New Covenant. And this is actually what's so interesting about Jesus, is that he's introduced into this story as the one who fulfills all of these covenant relationships. We're told that he's from the family of Abraham, and so he will bring the blessings of that family to the whole world. We're told that he's the faithful Israelite who is able to truly obey the law. And we're told that he's the king from the line of David, and so he goes about extending God's kingdom of justice and peace to all.
And that's really remarkable for one guy.
Yeah, and what it highlights is perhaps the most surprising claim of all made about this man, that Jesus is no mere human, but rather God become human. And God did this in order to be that faithful covenant partner that we are all made to be, but have failed to be. And so through Jesus, God has opened up a way for anyone to be in a renewed partnership with him.
So Jesus calls people to follow him and become part of this new covenant family.
And despite their failures, Jesus is committed to making them into partners who are becoming more and more faithful.
The story of the Bible ends with a vision of a fully renewed world, full of goodness and peace.
And there's this renewed humanity there, partnering together with God to expand the goodness of his creation. And so the end of the Bible story is really a new beginning.
Okay. Okay. So everyone could hear that, right? Hopefully it worked.
Yep.
Okay. So by the way, I've had the hiccups on and off all day, so hopefully that doesn't become too much of a distraction. So right there, that illustrated the idea of covenants, of how God sort of has these promises and agreements with other people. Sorry, how he has covenants and agreements with other people. And okay. Um, the thing about most of the covenants that you see is that mankind tends to break them, and this is why it's necessary for Jesus to come on the scene to be able to fulfill those covenant promises. One of the ones that I want to highlight and look at is the one with Abraham. Now, if you go back to the book of Genesis and read about God's covenant with Abraham, you'll see that one of the things that he told his Abraham to do was when he made that covenant, saying that, hey, you're going to have a lot of descendants and they're going to be blessed, uh, and they're going to bless the rest of the world. And he's an old man that doesn't have any descendants. What God does, is this too distracting with my hiccups? I feel like it's really distracting. Let me know, because I'm distracted.
I think you're okay.
Okay. uh, so anyway, one of the things that he tells Abraham to do is to start a tradition of circumcision among his families and for the rest of his descendants for time to come. Now, I don't know if you guys know what circumcision is or not, so I'm going to give a brief description. It's basically where the foreskin of the penis is cut off. And you're like, what is the point of this? Why is God asking this to be done? Now, this is something that still happens today to some degree. There's some medical reasons for it. It's easier to keep clean. You aren't risking infection as much from doing that. In today's modern society, it's not as important because we have better methods of cleaning, so it's better. But there was something else behind it, why God was asking Abraham to do that for him and for his descendants and for all Jewish people. The idea was that he was setting them apart, how having circumcision was actually a way to sort of mark his people, and then to also say that this is a sign or a symbol of the covenant that God is making with the Jewish people. One way that we can sort of see signs or symbols today would be something like a wedding ring. Okay. Um, a wedding ring is a lot like circumcision. If someone has a wedding ring, it's pointing out a promise. It's a physical sign of a promise from one person to another. And circumcision reminded the Jews of their relationship with God, how they were sort of like set apart from the things of the world. They were cut off from the things of the world. And a wedding ring is a sign, a reminder to people that the person wearing a wedding ring is married to someone else. So what I want to do now is I want to read verses 25 through 20. I'm going to read the rest of the chapter, 25 through 29, and you'll sort of see where we're going. Now remember, Paul has just talked about, hey, Jews, you think you're better than everyone else because you've been given the law. And now he's going to talk about circumcision. And circumcision was one of the few outward signs that Jewish people could go and be like, hey, I'm special, I'm different, I'm literally physically marked for God. And this is what Paul has to say. Verse 25, circumcision has value if you observe the law. But if you break the law, you have become as though you had not been circumcised. So then, if those who are not circumcised keep the law's requirements, will they not be regarded as though they were circumcised? The one who is not circumcised physically and yet obeys the law will condemn you who, even though you have the written code and circumcision, are a lawbreaker. A person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a person's praise is not from other people, but from God. Now, one of the things that I want to point out is that when he's talking about in verse 28, a person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, you're like, well, I don't want to be a Jew. What's the point of that? And I want to let you know that you actually do want to be a Jew in spirit. And this is what that means. When someone is known as a Jew today, we know them as a descendant of Abraham. That they're Jewish because their mom or dad was Jewish, and their mom or dad was Jewish, and it goes all the way back. And there's this historical ancestry.com type lineage where you can trace it back and be like, I'm Jewish because of this person. However, the thing is, Jews were God's chosen people. And this seems a little unfair. Well, how come you have to be born into being God's chosen people? When Jesus came on the scene, he made it possible so that anyone could be born again, born into God's chosen people, God's family. So you could be spiritually a Jewish person. You could be spiritually a part of God's chosen people. And that's why you hear in the New Testament, it talks a lot about us being adopted into God's family. In the Old Testament, before Jesus even came onto the scene, provisions were made for people so that they could actually join the Jewish people and be a part of them, even if they were not a descendant. And all they had to do was follow God's laws and do what was asked of all the Jewish people. A good example of this is seen after the Battle of Jericho with Rahab the prostitute. Rahab the prostitute repents, says, I'm not going to be doing that anymore. She helps out the Jewish people, and she actually becomes part of the Jewish lineage. She's brought in and adopted. And so when it says here, a person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is one who's inwardly. It's talking about basically being a follower of Christ is what makes you a part of God's people. So going back to the beginning in regards to circumcision, what verses 25 through 28 is talking about, I'm going to use the wedding ring analogy again. It's basically like this. A wedding ring is a symbol in regards to what marriage stands for. Now, if I lose my wedding ring, it does not negate anything in my marriage. I'm still married. It doesn't mean that my marriage is worth more or less or anything. It's just an outward symbol. It doesn't negate it if I lose it. The other thing to think of is this. I can wear this wedding ring and I can go out and I can cheat on my wife. I can sleep with tons of women. I can do whatever I want to. Having my wedding ring does not mean that my marriage is pure and that everything is fine and wonderful. It's based on my actions as well. So when you look at it, my wedding ring is just a symbol that could mean something or could mean absolutely nothing at all. And that's what Paul is saying here in regards to circumcision. He's saying, hey, listen, in regards to being circumcised, well, anyone can be circumcised in the flesh, but it might not mean anything if your heart isn't in the right thing. The big thing that we need to remember is that physical outward signs don't necessarily indicate inside heart change. One good modern example that I can think of in regards to things that represent our relationship with God is baptism. People get physically baptized. I know that some of you have been physically baptized. But the thing is, it's just an outward action. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's been a heart change. There are people today who go, oh, I've been baptized, I'm going to heaven, that's it. I'm like, well, no, that's not necessarily the case. Where's your heart with the Lord? Same thing, this is what Jews were doing with circumcision. Well, listen, I know the law, my family has known the law for years, I'm circumcised, I've got it made. My covenant with God is held firm in that. And what Paul is saying here is, no, that's not the case. It's not about that, it's about more. The heart is more important than the body. 1 Corinthians 7:19, something that this is from a letter that Paul wrote to the church in Corinth. He wrote this: circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of the law is what matters. And I mentioned before that the commandments of the law can be summed up in two things: love God, love God, and love others. So our hearts need to be set apart for God, to love Him and to keep His commandments. The physical is only beneficial if it points us towards the spiritual. I think it's great for people to get baptized, because baptism is like an outward symbol of what God is doing in one's life. They can look back to it, they can remember it, they might have a baptism certificate, they might have pictures, they might remember their anniversary and go, I remember when that happened. Same thing that a wedding ring can remind me when I look at it, when I might be having hard days, that I'm married to a wonderful woman who is absolutely amazing, and nothing is going to tear us apart as long as we keep our eyes focused on God and on each other. So, physically, circumcision could have value if it helps the Jews focus on what they have. To the Jews back in Rome at this time, there would be value in them continuing to practice circumcision because it was a religious tradition that reminded them of God's ongoing covenant, how God had been faithful for thousands of years to them. For uncircumcised Gentiles, non-Jews, circumcision meant absolutely nothing to them. The whole big point is this: is one's heart dedicated to God through Jesus Christ? Circumcision means absolutely nothing to anyone until that question is answered. And then even if that question is answered, it doesn't necessarily mean anything anyway. What Paul did here was he told the Jews that one didn't really need to be circumcised to follow Jesus, and not to treat others differently or think they were better because they were circumcised. And he told the non-Jews not to worry if they weren't circumcised, but also not to treat the Jews who were circumcised any differently. Basically, he's speaking to two different groups here, saying, and it said that it didn't matter who was circumcised or not, but if it worked for someone else, to let them be. Just don't impose this on anyone else. The most important thing above all was making sure one's heart was in the right place. A person is not a Jew who is one only outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a person's praise is not from other people, but from God. Again, pointing back to what we talked about in the beginning of Romans 2, how none of us should be judging another person. It's all from God. So we get our judgment from God, and then we also get our praise from God as well. And this is very difficult for people of that time and era to see or understand, because everything was based on, hey, if I am living a good life, the gods are going to bless me. I'm going to have good crops. Good things are going to happen to me. There's going to be very clear, physical, tangible things that I see, a very quick cause and effect when it comes to how the gods are moving in my life. And Paul is saying here that it's deeper than that, that there's a heart change going on. And it's not necessarily about the physical. In a way, he's saying the physical doesn't matter as much. The other thing that he's doing here, and we'll see this in the whole context of Romans, is the idea of unity. Unity was one of the bigger goals and themes of the book of Romans. And Paul is saying here, outward signs are nothing compared to the inward changes of the heart. And what I love about this for us today is that outward signs mean absolutely nothing. It's about the heart. So it doesn't matter how big you are, how tall you are, how much money you have, or what color you are as well, that it's all about what's going on the inside. And so when I look at Romans, the last half of Romans, it's about us interacting with other people who may not have the same traditions as us. Some Christian churches frown on other Christian churches because they go, well, we didn't do it that way, or we do things differently. It might have great value for them, but it might not have any value for another group. And to force them to be doing those things that don't have anything to do with inside heart change is stupid. And then also the idea of don't treat anyone differently. As long as you are focused on God in everything that you do and letting the heart be changed by the Holy Spirit, then everything is good. So does that help everyone sort of understand that idea of circumcision? And uh, yeah, okay. Any questions about that section? Good. Okay.
I think that was a great explanation.
Okay. Cool. It's always can be tricky kind of being like, oh, let's talk about circumcision with like young people and what that's like. Another thing to point out here too that I appreciate and like is the idea that circumcision only applied to males. And the reason for that was because the world back then was male dominated. But now this circumcision of the heart, the sort of cutting away of the things that are not necessary or needed, this focusing on God, it's available to everyone. It's not just based on males. It's for females as well. And so I like the fact that as history goes on, as Jesus is redeeming and changing things throughout time, and trying to make it more the way that it should be, that there's less of a division when it comes between males and females. One of the things that Pastor Randy pointed out this past Sunday was how females were the first ones to realize that Jesus was resurrected, and that was countercultural because women didn't matter. It was all about men. But Jesus is saying that, hey, women do matter, and circumcision here being talked about this way is another way that that points it out, because everyone can have a circumcision of the heart, cutting away the things that aren't necessary and focusing completely on God.